for a moment and look around this space, what we see is very largely 900 years old. It's important to remember that it is a church that for 900 years people have come here for christenings, confirmations, weddings, and funerals, for saints' days, holidays, Christingle, Christmas, Easter. It is a special place for so many of us, and so many of you here, I know, share with Linda and me the misfortune of having had to bury your loved ones in the churchyard. It's important to remember that it's a place which is made up of the people who participate in it. The wonderful Liz Hode and her team who keep this place alive. Thank you, Liz. Is she here? You are wonderful. And it's important that I say so. Now, where do I begin? I'm going to begin with some of the important people who were involved in the early days of this church. And the first one is St. Nicholas of Myra. Who on earth was St. Nicholas of Myra? Well, he was a bishop in Turkey, a Christian bishop in Turkey, in or around AD 300. He is believed to have, I was going to say, committed many miracles, but you don't commit a miracle. He performed many miracles. He was a generous man. He was the kind of man who would give secret Santa presents to undowered maiden women who wanted to get married, but who, because they didn't have a dowry, couldn't. In those days when prenuptial arrangements were not common. He became the patron saint of sailors, of brewers, and of children. He became Santa Claus, and he is the origin of Santa Claus. And about the time this church was being built, there was a cult of St. Nicholas of Myra. It's no coincidence that at almost the same time as this church is being built, Studland Church, where I was christened, also St. Nicholas of Myra. Spirit of Santa Claus is with us every year, of course. St. Alban. If St. Nicholas of Myra is obscure, St. Alban really is obscure. He too was a bishop in Sherborne. I've researched him on Wikipedia. This tells me that he is best known for his learned text on virginity. It is said to be in very difficult Latin. This didn't stop it from being a bestseller. My third historical character in the background to this church is, of course, William the Conqueror, who took England by storm in a most unpleasant way in 1066. And unconstrained by planning regulations, let alone NIMBYism, unless you call revolting Saxons NIMBYs, which I think is a bit unkind. Within 20 years, he was building castles and churches up and down the land, and cathedrals. He died only 20 years or so after he conquered the country. The same year or thereabouts, the Doomsday Book was written, and according to Doomsday, he had already built Corfe Castle. And work must have been starting on Studland, and very soon will be starting here at Corfe, but also at Knowle, at Arne. You know the perfect Norman churches. They're one of the great treasures of the United Kingdom. Yes, HS2, let alone the third runway at Heathrow Airport. 20 years, it's nothing. It's amazing what you can do if you've got a conquered people who are prepared to be your slaves, and nobody who dares to fight against you, because if they do, well, I'm afraid it's not a very pleasant solution to the problem of NIMBYs. Now, let's talk about the church a bit. As I said, this is mainly what we see in the nave here, 1100. Some of the windows, the ones which are round-headed, Norman, the pointed ones, 1200s. The decorated window in the east end is a different matter altogether. Forget the stained glass. A decorated window would be in the 1300s. But it was, in those days, normal for the church to be in two parts. There's the nave here, owned by the people, and the chancel there by the priest. Some sort of gateway between the two, and above a rood screen. Now, I'm pointing at the glory of Worth Church, which is, of course, the Worth Arch. Simon Jenkins said, it's like a giant shark coming to gobble you up when you go in as a congregation. To my eye, it is absolutely magnificent. In fact, this church is a magnificent treasury of medieval art. Some of it, like the corbels. Now, I'm sure you all know what corbels are, but just to remind you, if any of you are thinking corbels, aren't they estate agents? The corbels are little stone sculptures under the eaves which run around the church, here and on the north side. On the outside, it's no use looking up, you can't see them from inside. I've asked Tim Arnold to photograph some of them because they're very difficult to see from the ground. And they're on this easel here. Get my glasses. And what do we see? A couple. You'll have to look at them. They'll be in the porch on the way out. Or a couple. Some of them are strange. People whose faces are either bearded or masks or animals. Some of them are funny. In fact, most of them are slightly grotesque. It's a tradition which seems a million miles away from us now, but it shows that our medieval ancestors had a terrific sense of humor. Some of them are very bawdy. You should see some of the disgusting ones at Studland Church. They're wonderful. Yes, bawdiness was, despite the rigors of life under a Norman conquering king, obviously a big part of medieval life. And it lives on because I have a very bawdy story about Billy Winspeed, which I can't tell in church, but if you ask me politely in the graveyard later on, I will tell you. Now, out here is the chancel, the vicar's part, and he had his own separate doorway, the south door there. And I'm not sure that Liz will let you go into the chancel. Liz, they're not allowed in because it's just not safe. But I've been in there recently, and above the doorway in the chancel there is, to my eye, the most expressive of the corbels. It's here in the photograph. It's impossible to tell whether it's Dame Edith Evans wearing some kind of extraordinary headdress or some rather frightening vicar, but it's extraordinary, and he's wearing spectacles, I think, or maybe he just had a bad night the night before. So what we're seeing is very old, very precious, very special. The rood screen would have looked rather like that modern stained glass window there. So Jesus on his cross, Mary and St. John beside him, and it would have been up there. But would it have been up there in this arch? I've looked at the paddle, obviously. Can I say, if you want to do some research, the paddle, you know, that piece of wood with the information about a church, is excellent. And it suggests there is some doubt about this arch here. But I've looked at the real stuff, the wonderful little yellow booklet which you can buy. I think it's still on sale here by Edward Carthew, is it? Caffrey, Edward Caffrey, thank you very much, who has done a lot of homework on it. Views differ about whether this arch is original. If you look down here at the sides, it appears that there was going to be some kind of side altar originally attached to it. And that's led people to suspect that in the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536 to 1539, come on, you all read Wolf Hall or saw it on television. Thomas Cromwell, acting on behalf of Henry VIII, decides to invent privatization and confiscates abbeys, monasteries up and down the land. And if the buildings weren't, I'm so sorry if I've offended you. If they couldn't be sold off, the better bits of architecture were sold off, or maybe even given away sometimes. And here is something which, to some eye, is too big for the art. I think it's wonderful. I really think that this is as fine a bit of architecture as there is in Purbeck. It's just fabulous. And it makes this church, it's wonderful. It's the first thing you see when you come in. And it's unforgettable. The doorway there, where Tim is standing with his, now sitting, has got slightly similar patterns in it, but was not the original doorway. It's toothed, I think it's called. I've been reading, not from page 1 to page whatever, Trev Haysom's wonderful book, Purbeck Stone, which I strongly recommend you get and look at when you want to look things up and read some of the passages. Trev says it's, the one there is made of local stone. He can tell by the fossils in it. And if Trev says it's local stone, well then it's local stone. And above it, and you can see it's a Norman arched shape, on the far side of the doorway there is what is called the tympanum. Tympanum was a sculpture shaped in a semicircle. It's very badly damaged. I've asked that it should be photographed, and it's up there at the top of the board. Unfortunately, iconoclasm took hold in England at various times, but it's said to be troopers from Poole who shot with musket fire the tympanum and damaged it. Looks to me as if it's also had a certain breakage. And it is very difficult to read. It's supposed to be the coronation of the Virgin with some adoring attendants. It doesn't look like that to me, and I've had the advantage of looking at Tim Arnold's photograph, and I do suggest that you have a look at it too. How am I doing on time? Oh my goodness, I'm taking far too long. I do apologize. All right. Yes. Let's move on to 1786. In 1786, I'm sure many, if not all of you here, will remember there was a dreadful snowstorm at Christmas, and a wonderful East India clipper on its way from Greenwich to the East Indies, with a large number of people on board, found itself driven against the cliffs just to the west of Seacombe. The storm raged. There were men and women and children on board. 168 human beings perished. It was the weather that did it. It wasn't one of those cases where Cornish wreckers deliberately entice a boat to come onto the cliffs and then they can gather up the loot. It's not that at all. On the contrary, the villagers of Worth Matravers were heroic and did everything they could to rescue them when some of the crew ran from the boat, up to Eastington Farm. It's a terrible, terrible fact that the 168 survivors did not include a single woman. Why? Because in 1786 they wore long, full-length dresses. They wouldn't take off their clothes in order to climb up the rigging of the mast to get up onto some of the quarries or ledges or the cliffs, which would have made it possible for them to escape. There's a very dramatic and fanciful, I expect, version of it by Charles Dickens. But those of us who are lucky enough to hear it know that there is a very good book called Dr. Pierce. Not Dr. Pierce, Captain Pierce. Captain Pierce, which tells the story of what happened and what went wrong, and as usual, there was mistake and so on, but nothing else. Now, why am I introducing the hall swell? If you look about the doorway there, you'll see there's a little mirror. And that mirror is one of the things which is a treasure from the hall swell wreck. In fact, if you go into Charlie Newman's museum at the Square and Compass, I strongly recommend. I don't see Charlie here today. He's probably preparing for us later on. But there are lots of little buckles and other artifacts which come from the wreck of the hall swell. And the reason I'm particularly attached to this lovely mirror, it's photographed there, but you will see it as you leave, is that the village was given a pension, it's called, by the East India Company because of the wonderful way in which the village behaved in those days. 1872, restoration work was done, the box pews taken out and these Victorian pews put in. A pyramid was added to the top of the tower. Yes, I should have said the tower is original but possibly extended, so though it's an 1100 tower, it's a Victorian roof that it has. And I think that's all that one needs to say about the Victorian restoration. But there is a Victorian artifact, or early 20th century, which I find particularly moving. It's called The Child at the Gate. And it's the photograph there. It's a piece of stained glass. And if you look at the back of the church there, under the tower, I've asked that the light be turned on so that you can see it clearly. One of the loveliest men who lived in this village was called Alan Younger. He was a very, very fine stained glass window designer. And he and I were talking about that piece, and he said to me that he thought it was wonderful. This is the man, Alan Younger, who designed the rose window in St. Albans Cathedral, who designed the east window in the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey. He really knew his design in glass. And can I say, the most perfect artifact that you can possibly imagine, to my eye anyway, is that tiny window in St. Albans Chapel. It's so poetic. It's made of genuine ancient glass, which Alan had collected and treasured. It echoes the sky, the fields, the dry stone walls. It is just perfect for that very special Very strange place. 300 feet up above the waves and the race. And Alan says that piece, which is by a man called John Houghton Bonner, I'm sorry, is a liminal piece. What does he mean by liminal, I asked. Well, she isn't quite a child, she isn't yet quite a woman, she isn't quite alive, she isn't yet ascended into heaven. It's a threshold. There is a gate to symbolize that. To me, as a parent who lost a child buried in the churchyard here, it speaks of grief. And I just find it very moving. And I'm sure that if you take a moment to look at it, many of you will too. Enough of gloom. I have some more gloom, I'm sorry, I forgot. It's possible that there were 3 pandemics here. I'm going to take them a good deal more quickly. What time do I have to finish, Nicholas?
I think, as long as you finish in time for us to get up.
No, we've got to go to the village hall. Half of you are going to the village hall for a quarter of an hour, and half of you are coming with me to the churchyard to look at the graves. And then we're going to switch you over. And the ones who came to the graves with me will go to Mary Sparks in the village hall. Right. 3 quick pandemics, just to cheer you up. 1347, an enormous work was going on East Man and West Man, the construction of the strip lynchets. What were strip lynchets for and about? Some strip lynchets are Neolithic, but ours were being constructed in 1347 or 1348. And then they're abandoned suddenly. Why? Why would you abandon something which had taken an enormous amount of organization that would have involved a large number of the members of the village community and hereabouts to construct? They're there because they increase the productivity of the land by terracing, and they're abandoned because of the Black Death. Whether the Black Death actually decimated the village, after all, it wasn't just 1 in 10, it was 1 in 50 that it killed in the country at large. It was a terrible plague, but it's not a coincidence. It cannot be a coincidence that the work is abandoned about the time of the Black Death. It must have come to Worth. We know no more. One of the strange things about this church is that the south door was originally there, I think. There was some sort of transept or extra wing put on so that more people could come in. But because of and you can see on the outside where the doorway originally was, but around the corner, just around the corner, tucked in behind the archway there, is a leper's squint. I asked for a photograph of it, and it is, it's here somewhere. Oh, there it is. You can see it from there. It's now glazed. It may not have been glazed. It's unlikely to have been glazed, I suppose, originally. Why would there be a leper's squint? Well, leper's squints were normally for the lepers. Why would you have a squint for lepers? It's because the disease of leprosy disfigures people and was frightening and thought to scare off the population. Also, it was feared that it was contagious and that they might catch leprosy from it. And so they were not allowed to come into church on a Sunday. But they wanted to go to heaven too. They wanted to see the host elevated. And so they came after the congregation, assembled outside, and a window was placed there for them. Now, it's possible that it isn't a leper squint, but I think it's difficult, bearing in mind the layout of the church, to think of any other reason why anybody would have put an angled window in that position. It suggests to me that leprosy came to Worth, and I've read that there was a lepers colony at St Albans. And the third pandemic was smallpox. Now, in the churchyard is a double grave to Benjamin Jesty and his wife. But it talks about cowpox. What is cowpox? What was smallpox? Well, in the 18th century, smallpox was a terrible disease, a terrible plague. It killed thousands. It killed millions. And in due course, a man called Edward Jenner, a doctor, devised, he said, a method of saving people's lives. He was the original inoculator, according to people at the time. He was awarded by Parliament the sum of £30,000. I've consulted Wikipedia on the subject. It's worth well over £1 million today. Imagine if Boris had given £1 million to the people who invented the vaccination in our COVID. It was a fabulous, but 20 years before, Benjamin Jesty was injecting people in Yetminster in Somerset, where he was a farmer, and I'm going to tell you what he did and why he did it. He was injecting them with cowpox. What had been noticed in the smallpox pandemic was that some people didn't seem to get smallpox. Who were they? They were the dairymaids who milked cows with cowpox. And the step taken then was to have the women who had apparently got this immunity from smallpox to be the nursemaids for people with smallpox, because they wouldn't get the smallpox from the people they were nursing. Benjamin Jesty had had cowpox as a young man, and 2 of his dairymaids had had cowpox. And then smallpox hit Yetminster, and he didn't want to lose his 2 sons and his wife. So he took a darning needle and he scraped pus from the udders of cowpox suffering cows. And he stabbed his sons and wife with it. The sons had no reaction. The wife was apparently quite ill, but then, let's face it, some people did get a reaction to the COVID inoculations, didn't they? But none of them got smallpox. Benjamin Jesty moves to Dunshay Manor. I call it Dunshay, some people call it Dunshay, but Mary Spencer Watson called it Dunshay, and so if it's Dunshay for her, it's Dunshay, I think. Anyway, you can think me wrong if you do, if you wish. He came here and was in conversation with the vicar in Swanage, who was very interested in this, and they inoculated the vicar and Benjamin Jesty, 200 people in Swanage, and they didn't get smallpox when the smallpox was around. And it became fashionable to have a Jesty injection. Many of you will have read Paul Hilton's wonderful book, The Ingrained Island. He found a grave where the fact that the woman had successfully had a Jesty injection is actually mentioned on her grave. And so Benjamin Jesty really is an extraordinary hero. Actually, he was recognized in his own life because the vicar in Swanage wrote to the Royal Society, or I can't remember which particular medical organization it was, and told them about what Jesty had done and said, hey, Edward Jenner wasn't the first at all. But it was too late to get his £1 million. And he went up to London in his best farmer's wear, had a shave, it's mentioned in the book, and he got recognition in his own lifetime. I love the fact that there is a human being. In Wikipedia, it says, Edward Jenner, the human being who saved more people's lives than any other human being in the history of the world. Sorry, that's my paraphrase, but that's the effect of what they say. But actually, Benjamin Jesty, buried here in Worth churchyard, was one of the very, very few people who had the courage and the persistence to do this extraordinary thing. There had been other people, not in England, I don't think, a Lady Montague something or other, Worsley, I think, had been in Istanbul and came back with a version of it, but it's not this wonderful cure of using cowpox to cure or to protect people from. I see a professor of medicine looking at me from across the room. I probably got it all wrong, Howard, haven't I? But it's called variology anyway, or something like that. But really, he was the most extraordinary man. And he had to put up with a lot because of it, because when he did this thing of taking a darning needle to the tissue of an animal, people in Yetminster said he was a monster. He was shouted at and pelted in the market square. They said there was a danger that people would grow horns. But he stuck with it, and perhaps we should remember him. We who have not been members of the anti-vaxxer brigade, but have had our injections and boosters over the last couple of years.
Probably.
Fortunately, that is the end of my talk. Can you see there the original doorway? And then the round arches, the pointed arches, 1200s, and the difference between that part and this part. It's probable that the roof was lower at some point in the chancel at this end, because there are those two windows in the nave looking east up at the top, which otherwise don't seem to make much sense. I've already talked about this, but you'll notice it's cowpox that is mentioned, but not smallpox.
Yeah. Strange.
All right, this is a war grave. It relates to Molly. Well, you can see Molly Isabel Williams. She was a corporal in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and those of you who've got sharp eyes may have noticed she died the day before D-Day. If anybody has personal knowledge of Molly Williams, perhaps they'd like to tell us about her and why she is the only person here commemorated by the War Graves Commission. It would be very interesting to know. Something terribly sad. Important to remember that our village played a very important part in the history of radar and the detection of enemy aircraft coming over. And there were many, many thousands stationed here. The pub, incidentally, must have done rather well. Just up here, this is a very interesting grave. Louis Arbon Strange, 1891 to 1966. Airman and pioneer in the air. Now, if you ever find yourself short of something to do for a moment, can I suggest that you look up the Wikipedia entry for Louis Strange. He was amazing. Beagles had nothing on him. He was in both world wars. He was decorated to the eyeballs. He was a fantastically brave man, a very heroic man, but a very inventive man too. He was an inventor. He was one of the very first people to be in the Air Force in World War I. And he realized that if he got a machine gun on his airplane, he could use it to shoot at the other airplanes which the dastardly Hun were flying, and do some damage. So he put a circulating gun. I'm sorry, I'm not very technical on these things. And while he was attempting to adjust it, his plane flipped over, and he had to hold on to the plane and get back up into it to get the plane to right itself. And yet he survived. He got I can't remember, a DFC in bar, and became a teacher, and I think a colonel. I can't remember, but it's a wonderful story, and there are lots of other stories of his daring missions and so on. So I strongly recommend it. Now this here is William Jeremiah Bower, otherwise known as Billy Winspit. And Billy Winspit was a character, a long-standing member of the community in the Square and Compass, a quarryman, a fisherman, who lived in the house I live in now, Winspit Cottage. And he had a wonderful sense of humour and was invited to appear on early television and radio as our West of England correspondent when they wanted some funny joke about the antics of the politicians of the day. Anyway, Mary Cherry. Can I just ask, any of you know Mary Cherry? Yes, lots of you are related to her, of course. Mary told me, I think, a funny story about Billy Winspit, which brought him to light for me. Mary and her sister Elizabeth were walking down the lane to the Buntage, which was where their parents had, in those days, a wooden shack. And they saw Billy Winspit walking up. And this wasn't the Billy Winspit they were used to, who was always dressed in working clothes. This time he was wearing a black three-piece suit and had a hat on his head and a tie and collar. And they said, "Oh, Mr. Winspit," which is what Mary tells me they called him. "Oh, Mr. Winspit," they said. "You are looking smart. Where are you off to?" And he said, "I'm off to see my sister." Sorry, I can't do the accent. "I'm off to see my sister." "Oh, that will be lovely for you, Mr. Winspit," said the girls. "I'd rather rub my ass with a brick," he said. This is the tomb of the village's celebrity film star, Leslie Banks, and he really was a star in his time. He made 30 films. He was the lead actor in many of them. Now, what was it about Leslie Banks that is so memorable? He had a strange face. He'd been injured in the First World War, so that one side of his face was rather strange and serious looking, and the other side was a normal, different face. It meant that with good photography, it was possible to present two faces of him as a character. Anyway, my aunt told me, I don't know, I really shouldn't tell you this, but anyway, I will. Yeah. She was an actress. She told me she had an affair with him. But he lived in Lobster Cottage. He'd have been 25 years older than her at the time. But anyway, he was highly regarded as an actor in his time. This is the grave of a European woman of culture, Mary Spencer Watson, a wonderful sculptor who was the daughter of George Spencer Watson, who was a Royal Academician known for his portraits. And she lived with her parents in Dunshay Manor and continued living here until only a few years ago. She was so highly regarded that her work was chosen to be put outside the north access to Wells Cathedral. Many of her pieces are in local collections. You'll all know the quarryman outside Langton Church, which is very typical of her work. She was at the Slade, at the Royal Academy, where she learned how to sculpt, but it was really in Landers and Haysam's quarries where she was impressed by the work being done by the quarrymen of Purbeck, and she generally carved in Purbeck stone. There are two wonderful paintings that I'd like to mention by her father. One shows her running through the grounds, I think of Dunshay, with a pack of wild goats. as a young girl. She's running through the landscape. It's a lovely picture, but perhaps the one which he would want to be remembered by is a picture of that he described as his four loves, and it's a picture of his wife Hilda, who was a sort of dancer in a modern Isadora Duncan style. His daughter sitting on Mary Spencer Watson. She's sitting on his horse, beautiful grey horse, and there is his beloved dog, a greyhound. But I think there's a fifth love in the picture, which he doesn't mention, but which is there, to my eye anyway, which is the landscape of Studland and Purbeck in the background. It's a wonderful painting. It's big, and for many years it was in Mary's house at Dunshay Manor. If anybody knows where it is now, I'm not sure. But it's easy to find on Wikipedia. Look up Mary Spencer Watson and go and find her father, and you'll find the picture. This is Alan Younger, the stained glass designer who did that window at St Aldham's Chapel, and who was a lovely man. Very, very kind to us when we came to this village in 1995. Two very distinguished artists up here. Right, Sir Anthony Caro was a wonderful sculptor who had a cottage at the Coast Guards at St Aldham's Head. I sometimes used to see him and his wife driving along to their coast. He could barely see over the top of his driving wheel. He was a lovely man. He'd been Henry Moore's assistant. There are only 24 people who are awarded the Order of Merit, and he was one of them. Regarded as Britain's finest sculptor. Now, what was it about his sculpture that was different? Well, he didn't believe in plinths. He put things on the ground. Sometimes he's really quite abstract. They're all different, all imaginative. Use of stone. Did a lot of work in iron, metal. And this is his wife, whose name I'm afraid I've forgotten.
Lady Sheila.
Lady Sheila, but she was known as an artist in her own right. Was it Sheila Girling? Girling. Thank you, Chris. And she was a painter in her own right. She died, I think, less than a year after he did, after a very long and happy marriage. And it's so nice that they are next to each other in their graves. And yes. Oh dear, this is my son's grave, and it's looking a bit bedraggled.
It's got lovely roses.
He loved yellow roses. It's interesting how some names like Bauer and Turner and so on crop up across his churchyard. Any questions arising out of this morning talk? Well, I think in that case, we'll call it a day.
Thank you very much.